Hello, I'm Professor Matthew Rotella, and in this tutorial I'm going to go through turntable rendering and turning your image sequence into a video after you have finished rendering all of your frames. So, what I've got to work with is I've got this robot gorilla here that I modeled back in ancient times as a student, I think like roughly 6 or 7 years ago. But I figured I'd dig them up for this just as a fun thing to put on a turntable. Far from my best work, but yeah, like I said, thought it'd be fun. Okay, so regardless, we got our model that we want to create a turntable of, and you might want to put like a little platform underneath him to like render him on top of something, which can also demonstrate how your shadows are going to look and things like that. But or you can just have him floating in space, however you want to position your object. Alright, so yeah, so let's get this scene set up so we can get a turntable of this guy going. So yeah, I got my mans, I got him on a platform. Now the simplest way, now the very first thing that you're going to want to do is you're going to want to make a camera and position it. To do so, you're going to want to go up to the Create menu, and then Cameras, and then Camera. We'll create for yourself one camera. Now, I'm going to go into, which if you want to make sure that it stays perfectly on your, hold on. Go ahead and not show my light in the background there. Now, if you want to make sure that that it stays right on this y-axis, so it is therefore centered on your model, which ideally would also be centered on the origin, and then you can sort of go ahead and like position it and rotate it however you need, whether you want that to be a front on, or if you want more of a tilt. Usually I go for a little bit of a tilt down on my object to get a little bit more of a to get a little bit more of a dynamic angle, but you can also go for a tilt up if you're doing some sort of hero shot, but a tilt up could also end up looking like a horror story, so yeah, be careful with your angles, but the point being, get an angle. Now of course I can look through this camera as well and position it and rotate it, and what I can also do, which I'll get my resolution gate up, what I can also do is I could tear off a copy of this angle so that I could go back into my perspective view if I want to continue to be rather careful about how I go about positioning it so that I don't move it off of the right axis. But basically, yeah, get an angle going nice and centered. Since I want to be able to show off as much detail as possible, I'm filling up basically as much of the frame as I can with him. And there he is staring into your soul with his toilet head. But yeah, so I got my camera in place, and once you have it in place, what you may like to do is, or what you're going to want to do is keep it in place, which you can do two ways. You could put a keyframe on it by simply pressing the S key, which you can see by this little red line down here, as well as the fact that all of its attributes now have this little red mark that is keyed in place. Or what you can do is you can highlight all of the attributes, and you could key them here individually or all the time, or you can hit lock selected, which is honestly a bit more clean. And now if I were to bring up my rotation manipulator, I cannot rotate my camera. Same thing, these are grayed out because all of those attributes are locked, so therefore I cannot affect my camera. So I got my camera set up, aimed dead on at my man. Alright, so now, in order for it to be a turntable, the next thing that we're going to have to conquer is the spin. So, the very first thing, the simplest way to achieve a spin on your model would be to do this, which would be to group whatever you want to spin so that it has that uniform axis that you want it to spin around, and then key it, which this is my platform. So, which I could spin just my gorilla on this axis, which I have the pivot for, located at the origin, or I could group both of these, Control G, which group nodes by default usually have their pivot at the origin here, but I'm going to want it to pivot from the center of my my platform that I have here. So what I may in fact want to do is hold down the D and V keys to snap my pivot to the center of my cylinder there, and I could call this my turntable group or what have you. And then once I have that, now I just need to place a couple keyframes in order to have my objects in my scene rotate. So I'm going, for the sake of me not spending a ton of time rendering, this is only going to be a 24 frame turntable, which is way too short. You'll see at the end that my turntable is going to spin way too fast. What would be more practical is either a 5-second turntable, which would be 120 frames, or perhaps 7, or perhaps even 7 to 10. Any more than 10 is usually a bit slow, and you wouldn't want to go more than that typically. But in any case, gotta get these to rotate. Now, as you, what you could press the S key to key all these, but we'll keep it clean. We'll key it here at in Y at 0. So I'll hit key selected in Y because that's the rotation that's going to control this rotation here. And then I'll go to my end frame 24, and I will type in 360, which will be one full rotation. Key selected. And now when I scrub through, my gorilla rotates, which I can look through my camera 1 and see him rotate. Which, of course, if you want him to rotate the other direction, just key him in -360 at the end. Now, you'll notice as he's rotating, he does this stutter right in the middle. We're going to want to get rid of said stutter. And the reason why he has said stutter is because by default your keyframes in Maya have ease in and ease out. So if I were to select what I have my keyframes placed on, which is my group node, and then if I go into Windows, Animation Editors, and then Graph Editor, I can see I have this curve that that represents how my animation will play out. And this spline curve that's happening is what gives my keyframe its ease in and ease out. Now, to make this interpolation between the two keyframes linear, I can just click and drag to highlight both of them. And there's this guy right here, which is a shortcut for making them linear tangents, or you can go into the menu here, tangents, linear, but clicking this will do the same thing. Okay, I can close out of this, and now when I hit play, I'll get a nice smooth playback. Now, he still stutters a little bit at the end, which I'll make sure that my playback speed is correct by holding down right click, which I got play every frame, max real time, that's fine. I got my frame rate in the bottom here, letting me know that I'm cruising at roughly the same frame rate. A play blast will give you a more accurate representation of whether you were playing on point or not. But one thing that is still going to create a stutter at the end of our turntable is going to be the fact that he is doing one full rotation, which means that frame 24 and frame 1 are the same. Meaning that anytime you do a full rotation like this, what you're going to want to do is shave the last frame, which in this case I can just do 23 to limit my range, and then when I shave the last frame, I will get a nice smooth rotation. So if you notice that when you go to loop your video, that that your rotation stutters at the end, it is likely because of that you need to shave a frame, because the first frame and the last frame are the same, therefore it's playing twice, therefore you get that little hiccup. It could also have to do with just your video player reloading the video, if it and that causes it to stutter as well, but you want to make sure that you take this into account, so that way when it goes from frame 23 back to frame 1, that it is fulfilling the proper rotation. Okay, so now that I have that, and I have my gorilla rotating, he is essentially ready to be rendered. However, before I set up my render settings and get going, I'll show you one other way that you can go about creating your turntable. So instead of placing a keyframe on, so instead of placing keyframes so I'll delete this keyframe and delete this keyframe at the beginning. So yeah, instead of placing keyframes on this group node that I made and actually spinning the object, I can instead have my camera rotate around my object as opposed to my object spinning. Now this process is just mildly more involved, and doing it can be a little bit more frustrating, but it gives you different results. As to what results you prefer, you'll have to decide for yourself. Because the difference is, basically, if you spin your object, then your shadows and your highlights are always going to be placed in the same places on your surfaces when you go to make your turntable, where instead, if you were to have your camera rotate around your object, your textures and your well, your textures won't be sweating, but your shadows and your highlights will like stay in place on the surface, but you might notice that your highlights dynamically move because of your index of refraction and things like that. You'll just have to do some tests and figure out for yourself which one you prefer. But in any case, the way that this functions is you select whatever you want to pivot around, which I could have, which this is something that creating a platform can be helpful for, because you can have it pivot around the platform of your group. Or I mean, you can have it pivot around your platform as opposed to, like, let's say, okay, so let's say I had my robot gorilla, and let's say I had my pivot centered on my robot gorilla here, and like since he's kind of in a regular shape, that means I might get an irregular turn when I go to generate my turntable. So I can pivot around something that's circular to get a different result. Anyway, here we go. So what I'm going to do is I'll even just select my group, which has this pivot here, so I should get a pretty good rotation. And now, so you want to select whatever you're moving around. You're going to need to be in your animation menu set, and then you're going to want to go to the visualize, and then there's create turntable, which I'll open up the option box, and this was left over from when I was doing a 7-second 30 frames per second turntable, so that's 210 frames, but I'm going to set it again to 24 because I want my entire thing to happen in just 1 second, which again is going to be way too fast, but I'm not looking to render for a long time for this. And I'll have it spin clockwise, which is fine, and then I'll hit turntable, which will generate the turntable. And now when I scrub through my timeline, which you can see I'm no longer looking through camera 1, it has automatically switched me to this turntable camera that it has generated. And now, instead of my object rotating, I am rotating around my object, which will give me different results. And you can see that it still has that ease in and ease out. So I'm going to bring up my graph editor again. And it's not going to be on the turntable camera, which is placed within this group. It places the keyframes on this group node that the turntable camera is in. Same thing, highlight the tangents, make them linear, bada bing, bada boom, it's done. Now it's nice and even. And now let's render this out. Now my lighting setup is just this one skydome light that I have with some interface lighting put on it. But now let's get our render settings in order. So, got our render settings, and taking it from the top, let's give it a file name. So, call it robot gorilla gorilla, and then I'll do TT for turntable. And I want my image format to be EXRs, and I don't need to touch any of this other stuff, which if I had AOVs, I might want to merge my AOVs into my multi-layer EXRs, but the next thing that you're going to want to pay attention to is your frame/animation extension. Now, I tend to prefer name.number.extension, but Maya in fact recommends name_number.extension, but regardless, I'm stuck in my old ways. Name.number.extension is what I'm going to be using, but either one should work just the same in basically any program. So name.number.extension, like I said, name_number.extension also functions. Start frame 1, and then I could do end frame 24, but remember, the first frame and the last frame are the same, so I want to shave 1 frame off my end. It's rendered to frame 23. My renderable camera, I want to select the right renderable camera, turntable camera 1. Then I already have it. By default, it's going to be at HD 540. If you want higher resolution renders, HD 1080, you can type those numbers in manually, or you can select the HD 1080 preset from the list, and that's what I'm working with. So all that should be good. Changed my file name prefix, and my frame/animation extension. Your frame padding will control the amount of, let me see. Okay, so your frame padding will control this number right here, this 0157. So this is the 157th frame in this sequence. I like to maintain one leading 0 in front of whatever I'm rendering. So that would mean if I were to render something that was 1,500 frames, I would want to then make sure my frame padding is 5. But in this case, all the frame padding that I would technically need is 2 to handle going from 1 to a 2-digit number. But regardless, I'll just leave it at 4. 4 is fine, which will give me 0001, 0002, etc. as it's rendering, which you'll perhaps see exactly what I mean in just a second. But yeah, so if you're rendering higher number of frames, you may want to increase your frame padding. But yeah, file name prefix, frame/animation extension, frame padding, start frame and end frame, which is gonna be what defines your sequence. The render camera, you want to make sure it's the correct camera, and put in the resolution that you want. Alright, after all that set up, it's time to finally render. So, gonna go into switch from my animation to my rendering menu set, then go to render, and then batch render, which will begin rendering my frames. Which, when I hit batch render, down here in the output, you'll see it spinning up the batch render process. And if you want, you can also have general editors. You can have your script editor open, which can also give you different progress. It can show your progress in a different way. In any case, render, batch render. Now here it will go. Give it just a second while it's setting everything up. It creates a cache of sorts. You can see it's saved a temporary file. And here it goes. Alright. So it'll give you your progress, what frame it's on, and it'll give you where it's rendering to, which by default will be your images folder. Now while all of this renders, I'm just going to stop recording and resume in a bit. Alright, and now a decent bit of time has passed, and I have finished rendering my sequence, which I can see rendering completed, has showed up here in my output. And all of the images which defined up here, which you can change where that file path will be in your project settings, but by default your images will always render into the images folder of whatever project you're working in. I'm still in the default project, so here's my sequence, Robot Gorilla Turntable, in my images folder. And again, this number here, this 4-digit number, is determined by my frame padding. It has 2 leading zeros because there's a frame padding of 4 digits, 2 zeros, and then of course the number that represents the frame on my timeline that it is. Alright, now, what I want to do is I want to turn that image sequence into a video. So I'm going to open up Adobe Media Encoder here, and we're going to get right into it. There are lots of programs you could use. It's like QuickTime Player used to have a good image sequence. Well, I mean it does, but whatever. Adobe Media Encoder, here I am. Alright, so... Alright, now, what I can do is I can get that image sequence. To get that into here in Adobe Media Encoder, what I have to do is I have to add a source. I could go up here to File, or File and then Add Source, or I could simply hit the plus icon here. Now, here I am in my images folder. Maya Projects Default Images, and let's see, default images, here we go, robot gorilla turntable, and then I'll click the first frame, and if you click any frame it should work, but I'll click the first frame. But the important thing is that you want to make sure that OpenEXR sequence or PNG sequence or whatever you got, you want to make sure that this boy is clicked right here. If it's not clicked, then it won't import as the video file that you want, and that's no good. So I'll hit open, which will add it into the queue. You can queue up lots of videos and then press go, and it'll do all of them in a row if you have lots of sequences that you need to render for some reason. And before I do that, I'll make one note about the preferences, that it will oftentimes behoove you to make sure that if you go into the media section of your preferences, that your intermediate media time base is the same frame rate as the video that you want to render. By default, it's going to be at 29.97 drop frame, I'm pretty sure. You want to make sure that's 24 frames per second. If it's not, you could end up getting media that is either playing faster or slower than it should, depending on what your intended frame rate would be. Even if you set the correct frame rate here in your settings. So I just want to make note of that. And now, to open up the settings for my export, I can click on this one here, which this is the name of a preset that I have, which by default it's going to be set to match source high bitrate. That's going to be the default setting, and I can scrub through and see what my render is looking like. And alright, so now I want to change my settings to more aptly fit what I want to do, and to get the most quality out of the render that I have here. So, well, first of all, the sequence doesn't have any audio, so I'm just going to uncheck export audio. Don't need it. Trying to export audio could somehow cause an error, and if you just uncheck that box, then all of those potential errors are eliminated, which again, why take the chance when we're not rendering audio in the first place? And also, you want to make sure that your encoding format is H.264. This is the format that you want. H.264 will give you MP4s. If you want MOVs, there are other codecs to work with. Like if you're working, like if you want, yeah. Yeah, like if you want MOVs, Apple ProRes can be a good one to go with, or rather QuickTime. It would be your move for MOVs, but again, I want H.264 compression. It's a good and high efficiency compression, and now we'll start going through your settings here. Frame rate. If you want to change anything, you have to uncheck the box, and then you're able to access the setting. Now, I want my frame rate to be 24, so I'm just going to leave that checked, but yeah, frame rate 24, and that would be the first thing that you would want to check. You want to make sure that your width and your height are the proper resolution, which by default they should be, as it's matching the source that's coming into it. Now, here, what I want to do is I want to change my profile from main, so I uncheck the box, to high. If you're working with HD video, you'll likely want to change your profile to high. And after that, I can kind of ignore the rest of these settings until we get to bitrate settings. And I want to change this to VBR 2-pass, which will give me a second pass of compression and encoding, which will ultimately give me higher, which will ultimately give me higher quality video encoding with less artifacting and less noise. And now I want to up my target bitrate from this 10 that it is by default, which will give you something decent, but for most professional work that I do, I tend to prefer my target bitrate be more at 50, which the more, which this is your megabits per second, the more bits per second you can have in your video, the more data and the more quality will be encoded into your video. And I'll give it a little bit of wiggle room where to 55, because I don't want to get too crazy, but setting our maximum bit rate allows it to put more detail and time into places where Media Encoder thinks that your video might need it. And then lastly, I'll just hit the use box, use maximum render quality, and that should do her. So, alright. So to recap, unchecked audio, make sure that your width and height are correct, your frame rate is correct, you want your field order to be progressive, your performance, you can, well, it changed it to software encoding when I changed other settings. Yeah, software encoding, you want to change your profile to high if you're working with HD video, and then you want to change your bitrate encoding to VBR2 pass for better results, and then personally I like to make sure that mine is up at 50 or 55. If you notice a lot, which you can tweak it to be less if you want, but the main thing is if you're noticing a lot of compression artifacting in your video, especially in your blacks, you want to increase your bitrate. And then, yeah, once that's adjusted, use maximum render quality. And if you want to change what your output name is going to be and where it outputs to, you can click on these blue words up here, and you can change both of those things, the output name, and navigate to a different folder where you can output it to. But I'll just leave the default name, and by default it will output the video to the same folder that the sequence exists in, which I'll just say is fine in this case. And I'll hit OK. And you can also change that same thing here. And if you want to save this as a preset, you always can. Yeah, by which if you want to save something as a preset, you can always change this or save this as a preset by hitting Save Preset right here, and it'll save all these settings, and you can just load it right into there if you find yourself using settings frequently. Anyway, I'll hit play. It'll show the preview, the output of my video down here, and give me a little progress bar. And bippity boppity boo. It's only 23 frames, that went pretty quick, and I'm done. Now I can look here, and I can open this guy up, and there's my turntable. Which, as I mentioned before, you might notice a little bit of a stutter when it goes to loop the animation, and also, as I mentioned before, the 23 frames or a 1 second turntable is way too short. You're definitely going to want more frames. Roughly, usually a good speed is 120 frames at 24 frames per second, which will give you a 5-second turntable. But then you can get even higher fidelity, like 30 frames per second for 7 seconds, 210 frames, and that'll give you a nice, smooth, well-paced turntable as well. But you can end up experimenting with what you like and what you feel you can get away with. But that's the whole process, from the 2 different ways that you can set up your turntable to spin, to setting up your render settings, rendering your frames, and then getting them into Media Encoder, setting up your Media Encoder settings, and then exporting it to get your final video. Alright, I hope you learned, and had a reasonably nice time. Thank you for watching.